Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start tonight with a question. Not a comfortable one. A question that I suspect very few people in this room have asked themselves out loud, though I suspect almost everyone has asked it silently late at night, when the house is quiet and the mind will not stop turning. Here is the question. If you knew, really knew, that you had perhaps 5 years left, perhaps 10, what would you want to have been true? I ask this because a book has just landed on my desk, a memoir, called simply My Story, written by a man now in his early 80s, a man whose entire public life has been devoted to persuading others that the universe is, in his words, nothing but pitiless indifference, no design, no purpose, no one home, so to speak, behind the cosmos. And now at 82, with health beginning to fail, he has written his story. I find that title almost unbearably poignant, because here is a man who has spent 50 years telling us that we are the product of blind, purposeless processes, and yet he has felt compelled at the very end to write a story, not a data set, not a set of equations, a story with a beginning, a middle, and inevitably now an approaching end. Stay with me for the next half hour, because I want to walk through why that title matters more than he perhaps intended. Well, what his memoir reveals about the deep hunger every human being carries, whether they admit it or not. And this is where it gets interesting, why the very act of growing old and looking back on one's life is itself one of the most powerful pieces of evidence we have that his worldview cannot be lived out consistently, even by its most brilliant defender. Let me begin with an observation from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who is, I should say, no friend of religious belief. Nagel wrote that it is difficult to avoid the impression that something is amiss with a purely materialistic account of the universe, precisely at the point where it must explain consciousness, reason, and value. Nagel is an atheist. And even he says, the reductionist story does not add up. Keep that thought in your back pocket. We will return to it. Now, why does a man write a memoir? Think about it carefully with me, because this is not a trivial question. An animal does not write a memoir. A rock does not write a memoir. Even the most sophisticated computer, chess engines, language models, none of them, left to their own devices, sit down and compose a reflective account of their own existence, wondering what it all meant. Human beings do this. We alone, so far as we know, in the entire cosmos. Pause at the end of a life and ask, what was the shape of it? What did it mean? Did it matter? C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, makes an observation that I think is the key that unlocks this entire subject. He says that if you find in yourself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that you were made for another world. Lewis was not being sentimental. He was doing philosophy. He was pointing out that desires, as a rule, correspond to real objects. We feel hunger and food exists. We feel thirst and water exists. We feel sexual desire and sex exists. We feel loneliness and companionship exists to fill it. So what about this desire? Universal, ancient, cross-cultural, the desire to know that one's life meant something, that it will be remembered, that the story had a point. If the universe truly is, as our memoirist has spent his career insisting, a blind and purposeless place, why would evolution, which is supposed to be ruthlessly efficient, wasting nothing, burden us with a longing for significance that corresponds to absolutely nothing real? That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a genuine puzzle for the naturalist. And I want to suggest to you tonight that the writing of a memoir at 82, with health declining, is itself an unconscious admission that the story matters. That is the first curiosity I want to plant in your mind. Hold on to it, because in a few minutes I am going to show you something even more revealing buried in the logic of memoir, writing itself. Let's talk about the man's central argument, the one he has repeated for decades. The argument, roughly, runs like this: given enough time, and given the mechanism of natural selection acting on random variation, you do not need a designer to explain the complexity of life. The blind watchmaker, to use his own famous phrase, does the work that we once attributed to God. Now, I have enormous respect for the empirical work of evolutionary biology. I am a mathematician, not a biologist, but I know good science when I see it, and natural selection is good science as far as it goes, describing how existing life diversifies and adapts. But here is the question our memoirist's own framework cannot answer. And this is where the mathematics comes in. Where does the information come from in the first place? DNA is not merely a molecule, it is a code, a functioning symbolic, language-based information storage and retrieval system, more sophisticated by orders of magnitude than any computer code written by human engineers. The late Antony Flew, and this is a man worth pausing on, was for decades the most prominent atheist philosopher in the English-speaking world. He debated theologians for 50 years, always on the side of unbelief. And then, in his old age, examining precisely this question of biological information, Flew changed his mind. He said that the evidence of DNA had convinced him that some form of intelligence must have been involved because, in his words, the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements needed to produce life pointed to the work of intelligence. Bill Gates, no theologian, has said that DNA is like a software program, but far more advanced than any software ever created. Now consider in all of human experience, information, real functional symbolic information, has one and only one known source: mind. We have never once observed random, unguided processes generate a genuine code from scratch. Not once. And yet we are asked to believe that the most sophisticated code in the known universe, the code running every cell in the body of the man writing his memoir, assembled itself with no mind involved at all. I want to give you a number. because numbers concentrate the mind wonderfully. The mathematician and origin of life researchers have calculated the odds of even a single small functional protein forming by chance to be so small that if you tried every possible combination since the beginning of the universe, using every particle available, you would still fall staggeringly short. Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, again, no friend of religious apologetics, famously compared the chance of higher life, forms emerging by pure accident, to the likelihood of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a fully functioning Boeing 747. Hoyle was not a Christian. He said this as a scientist looking honestly at the numbers. So here is curiosity number 2 for you to sit with. If the code inside every one of our memoirists' own cells bears every hallmark of intelligent authorship, what does it mean that a man built entirely out of that authored code has spent his life insisting there is no author? Let's turn now to the second half of the title. Not my story, but the fact that it is being written by a man of 82 in declining health. I do not say this with any cruelty, quite the opposite. I say it with the deepest sympathy because I am an older man myself now, and I have sat with dying friends, and I have buried people I loved, and I know that nothing strips away pretense faster than the approach of death. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called this being toward death. He said that it is only when we take our mortality seriously that we begin to ask what our existence actually means, rather than merely occupying ourselves with distractions. Samuel Johnson said it more memorably, nothing concentrates the mind so wonderfully as the knowledge that one is to be hanged in a fortnight. Old age and declining health are, in their own slower way, exactly this kind of concentration. And here is what I find so telling. If the naturalist worldview were true, if we really are, in the words of our memoirist himself, just dancing to our DNA, machines built by genes for the sole purpose of propagating those genes, then old age should carry no special poignancy at all. A machine that has finished its function should simply stop, the way a wound down clock stops. There is no reason on pure Darwinian terms why a human being facing the end of life should feel a special itch to leave behind a story, a legacy, a meaning. And yet every human being does. Every single culture in history has produced deathbed reflections, memoirs, last testaments, final letters to children. This longing is not culturally constructed. It is universal. And universal longings, as Lewis pointed out, are the strongest clue we have to what we were actually built for. I want to bring in one more voice here because I think it will surprise you. Steven Weinberg, the Nobel laureate physicist and an atheist of considerable standing, wrote one of the most quoted lines in modern popular science. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But listen to what Weinberg said just after that famous line, which is quoted far less often. He said that the effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy. Think about what Weinberg is doing there. He is smuggling meaning back in through the side door, even while officially denying the front door exists. He calls the universe pointless, and then in the very same breath tells us that seeking to understand, it grants human life grace and dignity. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the naturalist's dilemma in miniature. They cannot help but speak the language of meaning, purpose, grace, tragedy, dignity, even while their official philosophy has no place to put any of those words. It is like a man insisting there is no music in the room while his own foot keeps tapping to the beat. Now, let me bring this back to our memoirist and his book, My Story. A story, properly understood, requires certain things that a purely materialist universe cannot supply. A story requires a beginning that matters, not an arbitrary starting point. It requires characters who make real choices, not merely the predictable output of chemical reactions. It requires meaning that accumulates across time rather than dissolving into randomness. And crucially, a story requires an ending that resolves something, that answers the tension set up at the beginning. But if this man's own worldview is correct, none of that is real. There are no real choices, only the illusion of choice produced by neurons firing according to the fixed laws of physics and chemistry. There is no real meaning. Only the useful fiction our brains generate to keep us functioning long enough to reproduce. And there is no real resolution at death, only cessation, the switching off of a biological machine, the same as a light bulb burning out. And yet, he called it my story, not my mechanism, my accident, not the meaningless sequence of chemical events that happened to occur in a body later labeled with my name. He called it a story. And I put it to you tonight that in choosing that word in the most personal act of his professional life, he has borne unwitting testimony against his own thesis. This is precisely the point C.S. Lewis made in his argument from reason, which I have always found one of the most underrated arguments in the whole apologetic tradition. Lewis pointed out that if our thoughts are simply the products of blind physical processes, chemistry obeying the laws of physics, nothing more, then we have no reason to trust that our thoughts are true, rather than merely useful for survival, but that the very act of constructing an argument that naturalism is true requires trusting our reasoning. So the argument saws off the branch it is sitting on. In the very same way, writing a memoir titled My Story, a story about a meaningful life, saws off the branch of a worldview that says meaning is illusion. I want to close now with what I think is the deepest gift the Christian gospel offers a man in exactly this position. 82 years old, health declining. Looking back over a story and wondering if he is honest with himself in the small hours, whether it was truly a story at all, or just noise that felt like a story, because the brain is built to find patterns even in randomness. The Christian claim is not that we invent meaning to comfort ourselves in the face of a meaningless universe. That would be exactly the fiction our memoirist would rightly mock. The Christian claim is the opposite. It is that the universe has meaning built into its very fabric, meaning we did not invent, but discovered. The same way a mathematician discovers that 2 plus 2 equals 4 rather than inventing it. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, said that we do not lose heart, for even as our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. Note carefully what he is claiming. Not that the body avoids decline. Paul knew perfectly well that bodies fail, that health declines, that 82-year-old bodies wear out exactly as the laws of biology predict. His claim is different and, I think, far more interesting. He claims that the story does not end with the body. That the author of the story who began it will also complete it. This is not wishful thinking bolted onto an otherwise bleak universe. It is, I would argue, the single hypothesis that actually accounts for the evidence we have been surveying tonight, the reality of information at the foundation of life, which points to a mind, the universality of the longing for meaning, which points to a true story rather than a purposeless one, and the strange, persistent human habit, even among convinced atheists, of speaking the language of purpose and grace and dignity as though we could not possibly help it. So here, at the end, is the question I want to leave echoing in this room. A man has written his story at 82 with failing health and called it simply My Story. I do not know what is in his heart as he faces what every one of us must eventually face. I hope sincerely and without any triumphalism whatsoever that somewhere in the writing of that book, in the quiet act of shaping a life into a narrative with meaning, he has felt the tug of the very thing his lifelong arguments have told him does not exist. Because here is the truth I want you to carry out of this room tonight. Every one of us, in the end, will finish writing our own story. The only question that ultimately matters is who the author is that we entrust the final chapter to.